If that man is dead in 4 minutes, don't bother calling the family. The trauma surgeon said without looking up from the monitor, his voice sharp enough to cut through the chaos filling St. Matthew Medical Center's emergency department. The automatic doors burst open as paramedics rushed inside, with a Navy SEAL whose uniform had already been cut away for treatment, his identification bracelet marked only with a restricted military code that few people in the room understood. Alarms echoed across the trauma bay while nurses prepared equipment, residents called out vital signs, and every available physician moved with practiced urgency. Standing near the medication cart was Emily Carter, a recently hired emergency room nurse with neatly tied brown hair, calm blue eyes, and a silence that had already made her the target of whispered jokes during her first week. Most people barely remembered her name. They remembered only that she never interrupted conversations, never defended herself, and never tried to impress anyone. Earlier that morning, one resident had laughed after watching her quietly organize supplies before sunrise. "She acts like she's preparing for a battlefield instead of a hospital," he joked, earning laughter from several coworkers. Another nurse smiled and added, "Maybe she thinks she's going to save the world with perfect supply shelves." Emily simply smiled, adjusted a tray that no one else had noticed was incomplete, and returned to work without saying a word. Now the emergency room had become exactly the kind of place where preparation mattered. The SEAL's condition was deteriorating by the second. Dr. Michael Harrison, the hospital's respected chief trauma surgeon, immediately took command, assigning experienced nurses to critical positions while pointing Emily toward the documentation station. "Stay on paperwork," he ordered without hesitation. "Watch and learn. Do not touch the patient unless someone instructs you." Emily answered with a quiet, "Yes, doctor," then stepped aside exactly as instructed. Around her, voices overlapped in controlled urgency. Medical equipment rolled across polished floors. A respiratory therapist adjusted oxygen flow while another physician requested additional imaging. Every pair of eyes focused on the patient except Emily's. She noticed something else. Her gaze lingered for less than a second on the SEAL's wrist before moving to the pattern of his breathing, then to the placement of a field dressing that looked strangely familiar. Her expression never changed, but something behind her eyes did. Almost instinctively, she glanced at the wall clock. For minutes, she quietly repeated the number inside her mind, as though measuring something invisible that no one else had recognized. Another resident noticed her watching instead of typing and shook his head. "If you're waiting for permission to become the hero, this isn't the place," he muttered. A nearby nurse smirked. She probably froze. First real trauma case. Emily didn't answer. She simply kept watching the patient with the same impossible calm that had begun making a few people uncomfortable without them understanding why. Suddenly, one monitor emitted a sharper warning tone. The room's rhythm shifted instantly. Conversation stopped. Dr. Harrison's expression hardened as he leaned closer, issuing rapid instructions while the trauma team moved faster than before. Someone reached for additional medication. Another called for backup equipment. For a brief moment, confusion threatened to outrun coordination. Emily looked once more at the wall clock. 3 minutes and 38 seconds had already passed. Then, for the very first time since arriving at St. Matthew Medical Center, the quiet nurse who had spent an entire week being overlooked stepped away from the paperwork station, walked directly toward the trauma bed, and calmly said 6 words that made every voice in the room disappear. "Please move. We're almost out of time." SUA, Emily did not raise her voice or push anyone aside. She simply stepped forward with the same calm expression she had worn every day since arriving at the hospital. Several members of the trauma team looked at her in disbelief, almost expecting Dr. Michael Harrison to send her back to the documentation station. Instead, the chief surgeon stared at the cardiac monitor for a fraction of a second before turning toward her. "You have something to say, nurse?" His question carried more skepticism than curiosity. Emily nodded once. "The pressure loss is not matching the monitor trend. We are treating the symptom instead of the cause." One of the residents frowned immediately. "She has been here less than a week. She cannot possibly know something we missed." Another physician quietly shook his head. "This is exactly why new nurses should observe before speaking." Emily did not react to either comment. Her attention never left the patient. She stepped closer, carefully observing the field dressing already in place, the The position of the intravenous line, the subtle movement of the patient's chest, and even the angle of his shoulders against the stretcher. Everything about her movements appeared deliberate but unhurried. There was no panic in her eyes, only careful calculation. "Doctor," she said softly to Harrison, "please let me check one thing." The chief surgeon hesitated. Around him, every second carried enormous weight. Finally, he stepped aside just enough to allow her a brief examination. Several people exchanged confused looks. Emily placed 2 fingers gently against the patient's wrist, then briefly examined the placement of a small medical patch secured beneath the edge of the bandage. Her eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. "There," she whispered. "That explains it." A resident leaned forward. "Explains what?" Emily calmly adjusted the patient's position by only a few inches. The movement looked almost insignificant, yet the cardiac monitor responded within moments. The rhythm became steadier. The respiratory therapist looked up in surprise. How did that change so quickly? Emily did not celebrate. She simply requested one additional piece of equipment and asked for a different intravenous setup. Her requests were quiet, specific, and unusually precise. Even the experienced nurses paused before following her instructions because they realized she was naming equipment in the exact order that she intended to use it. Dr. Harrison watched every movement without interrupting. Years of trauma medicine had taught him to recognize confidence, and what he saw in Emily was not confidence born from pride. It was familiarity. She handled uncertainty the way most people handled routine paperwork. One resident folded his arms. "This feels like guessing." Harrison answered without taking his eyes off Emily. "No, guessing looks nervous." Emily completed another careful assessment before stepping back half a pace. "His condition should stabilize now," she said quietly. "If we continue in this direction, we will have a better picture within the next minute." Nobody answered. The room simply waited. Seconds passed. Then the monitor displayed exactly the gradual improvement Emily had predicted. The silence inside the trauma bay became heavier than the alarms had been only moments earlier. Several staff members looked from the monitor back to Emily, trying to understand how someone who had supposedly spent the entire week stocking cabinets and completing paperwork had recognized something so quickly. Dr. Harrison finally spoke. "Where did you learn to read trauma patients like that?" Emily lowered her eyes for only a moment before answering. "From people who did not have time for mistakes." It was not really an answer, yet something about the way she said it made further questions feel strangely inappropriate. As the patient continued to stabilize, one of the experienced emergency nurses quietly began removing the patient's personal belongings so they could be documented before surgery. She reached for a worn identification chain tucked beneath the edge of the blanket. As the chain slipped into the light, Emily instinctively glanced toward it. For the first time since anyone had met her, the calm expression on her face almost disappeared. The trauma base slowly settled into a rhythm that only moments earlier had seemed impossible. The monitors no longer screamed with constant urgency. Numbers that had been slipping in the wrong direction began moving back into safer ranges one careful step at a time. Nobody celebrated because everyone inside the room understood that stability was only the beginning, not the finish. Still, the atmosphere had changed. Every pair of eyes kept drifting back toward Emily Carter. She quietly adjusted an intravenous line, confirmed another set of vital signs, and stepped aside without asking for recognition. It was as though her only concern had been giving the patient another chance. Dr. Michael Harrison reviewed the latest readings twice before looking directly at her. "You predicted every one of those changes," he said. Emily simply answered. "His body was already telling us what it needed. We only had to listen." One of the senior residents looked unconvinced. "Nobody can read a patient that accurately under this kind of pressure." Emily offered no argument. Instead, she walked to the imaging screen that had just displayed the newest scans. Without touching the monitor, she pointed toward one small detail near the edge of the image. "Please compare that angle with the previous scan." The radiology technician enlarged the image. The room fell quiet again. A physician leaned closer. "How did we overlook that?" Another specialist slowly nodded. "That changes the entire treatment plan." Dr. Harrison folded his arms, studying both the screen and the quiet nurse standing beside it. He had worked beside military physicians, university professors, and internationally recognized trauma experts. Yet the way Emily processed information felt different. She was not searching for answers. She seemed to recognize patterns before anyone else even realized they existed. While the operating room prepared for the next stage of care, Emily gathered supplies with remarkable efficiency. Every instrument arrived exactly when it was needed. Every medication was already waiting before someone requested it. Experienced nurses exchanged puzzled glances because her timing felt almost impossible. One finally whispered, "It is like she already knows what the next 5 minutes will look like." Another quietly replied, "She is always 2 steps ahead." Their conversation stopped when the patient stirred slightly for the first time since arriving. His eyes opened only briefly, unfocused at first, before settling on Emily. His breathing remained controlled as he studied her face with visible effort. The room expected confusion, but instead the exhausted serviceman looked strangely relieved. His voice was barely above a whisper. "I knew someone would remember." Emily's expression remained calm, yet something softened in her eyes. She stepped closer just enough for him to hear her answer. "Save your strength. You are safe now." The patient slowly shook his head. "Blue Ridge training." The words were weak and incomplete, but Emily understood them instantly. Her eyes lowered for only a moment before she gently adjusted his blanket and replied, "That was a long time ago." Dr. Harrison immediately noticed the exchange. "You know each other?" he asked. Emily looked toward him with the same composed expression she had maintained all day. "He needs rest, doctor." It was another answer that avoided the real question without sounding dishonest. The patient tried once more to speak. His lips formed only 2 quiet words before fatigue overtook him again. "Instructor Carter." Silence spread across the trauma bay. One resident looked at another in confusion. A respiratory therapist frowned. Even Dr. Harrison stood perfectly still, repeating those words in his mind. "Instructor Carter." Nobody at St. Matthew Medical Center had hired an instructor. They had hired a quiet emergency room nurse who organized supply cabinets before sunrise. Yet the respect in the wounded serviceman's voice sounded nothing like gratitude toward a stranger. It sounded like recognition earned years before. Before anyone could ask another question, 2 men in dark business suits stepped through the emergency department entrance, displayed federal credentials to hospital security, and calmly asked the receptionist one unexpected question. "Where can we find Emily Carter?" The 2 federal agents did not rush through the emergency department or raise their voices. Their calm presence drew attention all by itself. One of them quietly presented identification to hospital security before speaking with the charge nurse. Within seconds, whispers began moving across the department faster than any emergency call. Visitors looked up from waiting rooms. Residents paused in the hallway. Even experienced nurses exchanged uncertain glances. Federal investigators rarely appeared inside a trauma center unless something far beyond ordinary medicine had happened. Dr. Michael Harrison stepped out of the trauma bay and approached them with professional courtesy. "Can I help you?" he asked. The older agent nodded politely. "We are looking for Emily Carter." Harrison looked genuinely surprised. "She is one of our newest emergency nurses." The younger agent exchanged a brief glance with his partner before replying, "That is one way to describe her." Harrison noticed the unusual wording immediately. "Has she done something wrong?" The older agent answered without emotion. "No, doctor. We are here because someone recognized her." Those words settled heavily in the quiet hallway. Harrison looked back through the glass toward the trauma bay where Emily was quietly replacing supplies exactly as she had every morning since joining the hospital. Nothing about her appearance suggested she belonged in a federal investigation. Her uniform was spotless. Her identification badge carried only her name and nursing credentials. She moved with the same quiet discipline everyone had mistaken for simple shyness. Inside the trauma room, Emily appeared completely unaware that the conversation outside concerned her. She carefully checked medication expiration dates, reorganized sterile instruments, and adjusted a monitor cable that had become twisted beneath a cart. One of the senior nurses finally walked beside her. "Emily," she asked gently, "have you ever worked with the government?" Emily smiled politely, without stopping her work. "I have worked with many people." The answer sounded truthful while revealing almost nothing. Before another question could follow, a transport orderly handed Emily a small personal belongings pouch recovered from the patient. "He kept looking toward you," the orderly explained. Maybe you should verify these before we send everything to secure storage. Emily accepted the pouch with both hands. She opened it carefully and removed only enough to verify the inventory. A folded American flag patch, a weathered compass, a simple metal challenge coin worn smooth around the edges. The moment her fingers touched the coin, her breathing paused for the briefest instant. On one side was the image of an eagle. On the other were 4 words engraved so lightly that years of use had almost erased them. Stand quiet. Come home. Emily slowly closed her hand around the coin before anyone else could examine it closely. A memory flickered across her face so quickly that most people never noticed it. Dr. Harrison did. It was not fear. It was recognition mixed with the weight of something long carried alone. Does that coin mean something? He asked quietly after stepping beside her. Emily looked at the object for another second before placing it back into the evidence pouch with great care. It belonged to good people, she answered softly. Harrison waited for more, but nothing followed. Just then, the older federal agent entered the trauma bay with measured steps. He stopped several feet away from Emily instead of approaching directly. His eyes briefly settled on the challenge coin sealed inside the transparent pouch before returning to her face. For several long seconds, neither of them spoke. It felt less like 2 strangers meeting than 2 people silently confirming something neither wished to say aloud. Finally, the agent reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a thin black folder marked only with a small silver federal seal. He opened it slowly, glanced once at the first page, then looked directly at Emily and spoke in a voice so calm that everyone nearby instinctively fell silent. Miss Carter, there is one question we have been trying to answer for almost 12 years. Emily Carter met the older agent's eyes without the slightest hint of surprise. Around them, the emergency department had grown unusually quiet. Conversations stopped halfway through sentences. Stretchers continued moving down the hallway, but every member of the trauma team found a reason to remain close enough to hear what would happen next. The agent held the black folder in one hand, but did not open it again. Instead, he asked in a calm, measured voice, "Do you recognize Operation Granite Echo?" Emily remained silent for several seconds. Her expression never changed, yet the question seemed to carry the weight of years. Finally, she answered with only 3 words. "I remember everyone." The younger agent slowly exhaled as though he had just received confirmation he had been seeking for a very long time. Dr. Michael Harrison looked from the agents back to Emily, completely confused. "What is Granite Echo?" Neither agent answered him immediately. Instead, the older man reached into the folder and carefully removed a faded photograph protected inside a transparent sleeve. It showed a group of military medical instructors standing beside a field hospital somewhere overseas many years earlier. Most of the faces were partially obscured by helmets and protective equipment, but one woman stood near the center with the same calm eyes everyone in the emergency department had come to know during the past week. Her hair was shorter, her uniform carried no visible rank, and a subdued patch had been intentionally blurred before the photograph had ever been archived. The agent handed the picture to Dr. Harrison. That photograph was taken during a classified joint medical training program. He explained quietly. Every combat medic in that course later became an instructor for specialized rescue teams. Harrison studied the image again before slowly raising his eyes toward Emily. "That is you." Emily gave the smallest nod. It was a long time ago. One of the residents who had mocked her earlier felt his face grow warm with embarrassment. "You train military medics?" he asked almost in disbelief. Emily answered gently. "I help people prepare to save lives." The older agent corrected him with quiet respect. "Not just medics." He looked around the room before continuing. She trained rescue specialists from multiple federal and military agencies before her records were sealed. A wave of stunned silence spread through the trauma bay. The senior nurses looked at Emily with entirely different eyes now. Even those who had worked beside her for only a few days suddenly remembered small details that had never made sense before. The way she always checked backup equipment before every shift. The way she instinctively organized trauma carts in the exact same pattern. The way she remained perfectly composed when everyone else became overwhelmed. None of it had been ordinary. It had been habit-formed through years of extraordinary responsibility. At that exact moment, the doors to the emergency entrance opened once again. Several uniformed military personnel entered quietly, not with flashing lights or hurried movements, but with remarkable discipline. At their center walked a Navy commander whose expression changed the instant he saw Emily. He stopped several feet away, stood perfectly upright, and offered a respectful salute that surprised everyone watching. Emily did not return the salute. She simply gave him a warm, almost grateful smile. The commander lowered his hand and said softly, "Ma'am, it is good to see you again." Every doctor, nurse, and patient within earshot stared in complete disbelief. The commander then looked toward Dr. Harrison and spoke with unmistakable sincerity. "Doctor, the man your team saved today is alive because of your hospital. But years ago, many of us are alive because of her." No one spoke. The room had become completely still. Then the older federal agent opened the black folder one final time, revealing a single page stamped with an old government classification marking. He looked directly at Emily and quietly asked the question that instantly erased every remaining doubt in the room. "Miss Carter, after all these years, would you finally tell us who trained you?" No one in the emergency department spoke after the question was asked. The silence felt heavier than every alarm that had echoed through the trauma bay earlier that afternoon. Emily Carter looked at the open folder for a long moment before quietly closing it with one hand. She did not seem offended. She did not seem proud. She simply looked tired in a way that could not be measured by a long shift or a sleepless night. Her eyes moved from the federal agents to the Navy commander, then to the patient resting quietly behind the glass. Finally, she answered in a voice so gentle that everyone leaned closer to hear it. "I was trained by people who believed that every life mattered, even when nobody would ever know their names." The older agent remained silent. Emily continued before anyone could interrupt. "Some of them were military. Some were doctors. Some were paramedics. Some never wore a uniform at all. What they had in common was that they never stopped teaching, even when there was nothing left to gain." Dr. Michael Harrison listened without taking his eyes off her. He suddenly realized that throughout the entire day, Emily had never described herself as exceptional. Every answer had pointed back to someone else. One of the younger residents quietly asked, "Then why did you leave?" Emily smiled faintly, but sadness lingered behind the expression. "Because eventually the best instructors hope their students no longer need them." The Navy commander lowered his head with quiet respect. "Ma'am, you disappeared without saying goodbye." Emily looked toward him with kindness. That was the point. The mission was never to be remembered. The mission was to make sure all of you came home, able to help the next person. Those words settled over the room like a calm wind after a storm. The resident who had laughed at her on her first morning looked down at the floor, remembering every careless joke he had made about the quiet nurse who organized supply shelves before sunrise. He stepped forward awkwardly. "Miss Carter, I owe you an apology." Emily gently shook her head. "No, doctor. You owe your patients your very best tomorrow morning. That is enough." Even Dr. Harrison found himself unexpectedly humbled. During decades of emergency medicine, he had met gifted physicians, decorated specialists, and celebrated researchers, but he had rarely met someone whose confidence was so completely free of ego. He spoke honestly. "I judged you before I understood you." Emily answered with the same calm voice that had guided the trauma team only hours earlier. "We all make decisions with the information we have. The important part is being willing to learn when new information arrives." The older federal agent carefully placed the photograph and the folder back into his case. "Your personnel record has remained sealed for years because you requested it." Emily nodded. "I asked for an ordinary life." "And did you find one?" he asked. She looked around the emergency department where nurses hurried between patients, physicians reviewed charts, and families waited anxiously for good news. A gentle smile finally reached her eyes. "Yes," she said. "I found another place where people fight every day to bring someone home." For several long seconds, nobody spoke. The respect in the room no longer came from mystery or classified files. It came from understanding the quiet purpose behind everything Emily had done since arriving at St. Matthew Medical Center. Just then, a hospital volunteer hurried toward Dr. Harrison, carrying a cordless phone with an anxious expression. "Doctor," she said softly, "there is a secure call for Miss Carter. They said it cannot wait." Emily accepted the phone, listened for only a few seconds, and the peaceful expression on her face slowly disappeared. She quietly answered, I understand. I will be there immediately. When the call ended, the older federal agent searched her face and asked only one question. Another one? Emily gave a single silent nod, and for the first time that day, even the seasoned agent looked genuinely concerned. Emily Carter placed the cordless phone back into the volunteer's hands with the same steady movements she used while preparing trauma equipment. Only those who had watched her closely throughout the day noticed the subtle change in her expression. The quiet warmth that had returned to her eyes after saving the patient had been replaced by calm determination. The older federal agent closed his briefcase without another word. He already understood what the call meant. Dr. Michael Harrison stepped closer. Is someone else hurt? Emily answered softly. Someone needs experienced people. That is all I know. Before anyone could ask another question, the Navy commander received a brief message through his radio. He listened silently, nodded once, then turned toward Emily with unmistakable respect. Ma'am, transportation has already been arranged. Harrison frowned. Transportation? For a hospital nurse? The commander looked at him kindly. Doctor, today you met a hospital nurse. Years ago, we met the woman who taught us how to keep hope alive when every minute mattered. The words settled over the emergency department like a wave of quiet realization. A few moments later, another group entered through the main corridor. They were not loud. They carried no cameras and made no formal announcement. Men and women from different federal and military services walked in with measured discipline, each wearing a different uniform or agency identification. Yet something extraordinary happened as they noticed Emily standing beside the trauma bay. One after another, without receiving a command, they stopped walking. The hallway became completely still. Then every one of them stood at attention. Nurses paused in the middle of preparing medications. Families waiting outside patient rooms looked on in silence. Residents who had laughed at Emily only hours earlier could hardly believe what they were witnessing. No speeches were given. No medals appeared. There was only quiet respect offered freely by people who clearly knew something the hospital did not. The older federal agent finally spoke. Dr. Harrison, over the past 15 years, hundreds of rescue professionals have completed advanced casualty response programs connected to multiple federal agencies. Most graduates never knew the names of every instructor. That was intentional. But there was one instructor every class remembered. Harrison looked toward Emily. Her. The agent nodded. Whenever students thought a situation was impossible, someone would quietly ask one question. What would Carter do? A stunned silence followed. One of the younger nurses covered her mouth in disbelief. The resident who had dismissed Emily on her first day lowered his eyes, unable to reconcile the quiet coworker he had underestimated with the instructor now being described. The Navy commander smiled faintly. Every one of us learned the same lesson from her. Slow is smooth. Smooth becomes steady. Steady saves lives. Emily looked almost embarrassed by the attention. That was never my lesson, she said gently. I borrowed it from someone wiser than me. The commander shook his head. And now thousands of people carry it because you passed it forward. At that moment, the recovering patient inside the trauma bay slowly opened his eyes again. This time he was fully awake. He looked through the glass until he found Emily standing in the hallway. With visible effort, he raised his hand in a small gesture of gratitude. Emily answered with a reassuring smile before quietly placing her own hand over her heart. No words were necessary. Everyone watching understood they were witnessing respect built over years of service rather than a single dramatic moment. Dr. Harrison finally stepped beside Emily. You could have told us who you were. Emily looked around the emergency department where another ambulance had just arrived outside. If people only listen after they know your past, she answered, then they may miss what matters today. Before Harrison could respond, the older federal agent's secure phone vibrated again. He checked the screen, and for the first time all afternoon, genuine urgency crossed his face. He looked directly at Emily and said quietly, the team requesting assistance has just confirmed one more detail. The person asking for you is using the call sign that only one instructor was ever authorized to answer. Emily looked at the older federal agent for only a moment before giving a quiet nod. Tell them I will come as soon as my patients are stable. The agent smiled with genuine admiration. That is exactly the answer I expected. He put away his phone without another word. Around them, the unusual gathering slowly relaxed. The military personnel stepped out of formation, but the respect in their eyes remained unchanged. Dr. Michael Harrison stood silently beside Emily, searching for the right words. After nearly 30 years in emergency medicine, he had delivered countless difficult conversations to families, but this simple apology felt strangely harder than any of them. "Emily," he finally said, "I owe you more than an apology. I made assumptions about you before I ever gave you the chance to show who you really were." Emily offered the same gentle smile she had shown patients all day. "Doctor, everyone walks into a room carrying a story that nobody else can see. Sometimes we only discover it when life gives us enough time to listen." Harrison slowly nodded. "You saved my patient today. You also reminded me what leadership actually looks like." Nearby, the young resident who had joked about Emily's stocking supply cabinets stepped forward with visible hesitation. He held a clipboard in both hands as though it gave him something steady to hold. "Miss Carter," he said quietly, "I laughed at you on your first day. I thought you were overly careful. I thought you were slowing everyone down." Emily looked at him kindly. "And what do you think now?" The resident lowered his eyes before answering. "Now I think I have been confusing speed with preparation." Emily gently took the clipboard from his hands, straightened one slightly bent corner, and handed it back. "Then today was not a bad day. We both learned something." The young doctor smiled for the first time since the emergency had begun. Across the hallway, several nurses had quietly gathered near the trauma bay entrance. One of the senior nurses spoke on behalf of the group. "Every morning, we wondered why our equipment was always perfectly organized before the shift began. We thought housekeeping had changed their routine." Emily gave a small laugh. "Old habits are difficult to leave behind." "Please do not stop," the nurse replied. "You have made all of us better without ever asking for credit." The recovering serviceman was carefully moved toward the intensive care unit. As his bed rolled past Emily, he reached into the blanket and held out the weathered challenge coin that had been found among his belongings. "Ma'am," he said softly, "this belongs with you now." Emily gently closed his fingers around the coin instead of accepting it. "No," she answered. "You earned that long after we met. Keep it until someone else needs the reminder more than you do." The serviceman's eyes became bright with emotion as he nodded in understanding. Even the transport team paused for a moment before continuing down the hallway. Dr. Harrison quietly turned toward the entire emergency department. "Beginning tomorrow," he announced, "every new resident will complete emergency preparation rounds before each shift. We are adopting the system Emily has been using all week." Several staff members nodded immediately. No one questioned the decision. They had already seen the results with their own eyes. Emily looked almost uncomfortable receiving so much attention. "Doctor, it is only a checklist." Harrison smiled. "No, it is respect for the next emergency before it arrives." The hallway gradually returned to its normal rhythm. Families reunited with loved ones. Nurses answered call lights. Physicians reviewed charts. The extraordinary afternoon quietly blended back into ordinary hospital life, exactly the way Emily seemed to prefer it. She picked up a fresh pair of gloves, checked another patient's chart, and walked toward the next room without ceremony, as though nothing remarkable had happened at all. Just before she disappeared through the doorway, the older federal agent received one final secure message. He read it silently, looked toward Emily with renewed respect, and quietly whispered to himself, "They finally found the last student." 6 months later, very little inside St. Matthew Medical Center looked different to a visitor walking through the emergency department. Ambulances still arrived at every hour of the day. Families still waited anxiously beside patient rooms. Nurses still hurried through long shifts carrying charts, medications, and quiet words of reassurance. Yet the people who worked there knew something had changed forever. Every morning before the first ambulance arrived, every trauma cart was inspected with extraordinary care. Every oxygen cylinder was checked twice. Every emergency kit was arranged in exactly the same order. New residents often asked who had created the checklist taped inside every trauma room cabinet. The answer was always the same: a nurse who believed preparation saves lives before treatment ever begins. Emily Carter never asked for her name to appear anywhere on the document. She never accepted an office, a special title, or reserved parking. She continued working the same rotating shifts, quietly helping patients and encouraging younger staff members with patience that never seemed to run out. Whenever someone thanked her for changing the department, She simply smiled and answered, "The next patient deserves our best before they arrive." Dr. Michael Harrison noticed another change as well. The young resident who had once laughed at Emily now arrived nearly an hour early every morning. Without being asked, he checked equipment, reviewed emergency protocols, and helped new nurses learn the department's routines. One evening, Harrison walked beside him and asked, "What made you change so completely?" The resident looked toward the supply room where Emily was quietly organizing medication trays. "Because she never tried to prove that she was better than us," he answered. "She just kept showing us how we could become better ourselves." Harrison smiled. "That is leadership." Weeks later, the Navy serviceman Emily had helped save returned to the hospital wearing civilian clothes. He walked slowly through the emergency department, carrying a small wooden display case. Inside rested the weather challenge coin he had once tried to give back to her. Instead of presenting it to Emily, he asked the hospital administration to place it inside a simple glass case near the staff education room. Beneath it was a small engraved plaque containing only one sentence. "Preparation is an act of compassion." There was no name beneath the quote because Emily had politely declined every request to identify herself publicly. She insisted that the lesson mattered more than the instructor. Visitors often stopped to read the plaque without realizing the woman who inspired it might quietly walk past them carrying fresh blankets or helping another patient find the correct room. The older federal agent visited only once more. He arrived without ceremony, carrying no classified folder this time. Before leaving, he handed Emily a sealed envelope. Inside was a single photograph taken many years earlier. It showed a group of young rescue students smiling beside a temporary training shelter. Written on the back in faded ink were the words, "They all came home." Emily looked at the photograph for several moments before carefully placing it inside her locker beside nothing more than a family picture and an ordinary lunch bag. When her shift ended that evening, she changed into a simple jacket, quietly turned off the locker room light, and walked toward the parking lot beneath the fading colors of the sunset. No reporters followed her. No cameras waited outside. The military vehicles were long gone. The federal agents had returned to their own work. Inside the hospital, another ambulance had just arrived, and another team prepared to welcome strangers whose stories had not yet been written. Emily paused for only a moment, looked back at the emergency entrance with quiet gratitude, and smiled before walking home. Some people leave behind medals. Some leave behind speeches. Emily Carter left behind something far more enduring. She quietly raised the standard for everyone around her, proving that the strongest legacy is not built by being remembered. It is built by helping others become the kind of people who will never stop showing up when someone needs them most.